August 1944. A tense Joint Command meeting room in Normandy. Cigarette smoke hangs thick over huge paper maps spread across a wooden table. British staff officers are laughing, raising cups of hot tea, and celebrating what they call a flawless victory. They trade congratulations because the German army is trapped inside a collapsing pocket. But out the window, miles away, the reality is entirely different. British tanks sit idle, their engines cold, parked along a dirt road. They refuse to move forward, to plug the last escape route. Tens of thousands of German soldiers are walking right through that gap, retreating to safety. An American officer drops black and white aerial photographs onto the table, proving the enemy is escaping. The British staff glances at the evidence, pushes it aside, and mocks the warning. They order the American to leave. But this insult will not stand. General George Patton is about to find out exactly why those tanks are idle. This is the story of an American liaison officer who risked his career to expose a compromised battlefield victory, only for General Patton to step in and shatter a dangerous diplomatic compromise. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show when politics tried to pause a war. Major John Kelly was 32 years old. He came from the steel town of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and served as an armored liaison officer with the American 2nd Armored Division. Before the war, he worked as a foreman in a foundry, a job that taught him to recognize when metal was under pressure and when it was about to break. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a wife and a 2-year-old son he barely knew. Kelly had survived the desert heat of North Africa and the rocky hills of Sicily. He had watched his best friend burn inside a Sherman tank outside St. Lo. That loss left him with a deep, quiet anger against any form of waste on the battlefield. He could not stand incompetence, especially when it cost American lives. Now he sat in a humid briefing room, holding evidence that nobody else wanted to see. Brigadier Alastair Cunnington was 50 years old. He was a career British staff officer from an aristocratic family in Wiltshire. Representing the high command of Field Marshal Montgomery, Cunnington had spent most of the war in comfortable headquarters, far behind the front lines, managing public relations and map coordinates. His uniform was immaculate, tailored from fine wool, without a single speck of Normandy mud. His boots shone like glass, a detail of unearned privilege maintained by a personal orderly. Cunnington believed firmly in the old school of European warfare, where battles were chess matches to be played slowly and without unnecessary risks to one's own reputation. He viewed the war as an exercise in grand strategy and careful pacing. To him, the Germans were an enemy to be maneuvered out of position, not aggressively destroyed. He looked across the table at the young American officer with open condescension, treating Kelly like an undisciplined, reckless amateur who lacked the breeding to understand high command. By August 1944, the campaign in Normandy had reached a critical turning point. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a horseshoe-shaped pocket near the town of Falaise. To the north, British and Canadian forces pressed down. To the south, American armor advanced rapidly. The destruction of the entire German Western Front was within reach, if the Allied forces could link up and completely seal the geographical gap between them. It was an opportunity to end the war months ahead of schedule. However, the Allied coalition was fractured by internal politics, competing egos, and deep tactical disagreements. General Bradley and Field Marshal Montgomery had established rigid boundary lines on the map to prevent their armies from accidentally firing on one another. These administrative boundaries were meant to coordinate the advance, but they were now creating a dangerous paralysis. While the Americans were eager to push across the boundary lines to finish the job, the British High Command insisted on a slow, methodical approach. Other senior officers had let this delay slide for days, reluctant to spark a political crisis between London and Washington. The caution was proving costly. Every hour the Allied tanks remained stationary. German engineers worked frantically to keep the narrow escape corridor open. They organized retreats under the cover of darkness, moving vital equipment and veteran personnel. eastward toward the German border. The entire strategy of encirclement was failing because the final gate remained open. Inside the Joint Command headquarters, the illusion of a perfect victory was being maintained through careful paperwork and defensive bureaucracy, while the real war was slipping away into the dust of the French countryside. Major Kelly stepped forward and placed his palm flat on the large tactical map. "The pocket is breaking." "Brigadier," he said. Cunnington did not look up from his teacup. "The pocket is functioning exactly as planned, Major," he replied. Kelly tapped a finger against a narrow blank space between the blue ink lines. "Our reconnaissance pilots just brought these photos in," he said. "There is an 18-mile gap right here, and the German 7th Army is marching straight through it. The field marshal has things well in hand," Cunnington said, smoothing the front of his starch, stiffened tunic. "We are executing a controlled squeeze, not a panicked rush. My men are dying to hold the southern shoulder while your armor sits on its haunches," Kelly said, his voice tightening. "If you do not advance 5 miles north to close this gate, 20,000 veteran infantrymen will escape to fight us again in the winter." Cunnington finally looked up, his expression cold and deeply amused. "My dear Major, you Americans have a rather primitive understanding of modern warfare," he said. "You believe every problem requires a reckless charge and a massive butcher's bill. This is not a theoretical problem, Brigadier," Kelly said, slamming 3 glossy aerial photographs onto the map table. "Look at the dust clouds in these prints. That is the 2nd Panzer Division. They are pulling their tanks out right now because your boundary lines are protecting them. We do not alter a multi-army offensive based on a few blurry snapshots brought in by an agitated junior officer," Cunnington said, signaling to his orderly for more hot water. "The campaign plan dictates a measured, textbook victory, and we will not compromise British armor to fix an American miscalculation." "Those photos were taken 2 hours ago," Kelly said. "If you wait until tomorrow, there will be nothing left to trap but empty trucks and dead horses." Cunnington stood up slowly, leaning over the table with an arrogant sneer. "Your job is to facilitate communication, Major, not to lecture the British High Command on grand strategy," he said. "We are letting the enemy exhaust themselves against our perimeter. If a few shattered remnants manage to escape into the woods, it is of no tactical consequence. You may leave now and take your garbage with you." Kelly stared at the brigadier for 3 seconds, his fists clenched at his sides. He gathered the aerial photographs from the table, turned on his heel, and walked out into the corridor. He walked straight to the secure radio terminal at the end of the hall. He bypassed the standard bureaucratic routing and called the 3rd Army Liaison Desk directly. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, the heavy oak door swung open, and the room fell instantly silent. The laughter died in the throats of the British officers. Patton walked straight to the center of the room, his eyes locked on the map table. Patton studied him. Brigadier Cunnington remained seated, his hand still hovering over his teacup. "Brigadier, are your radio sets out of order?" Patton asked. "No, General, they are operating perfectly," Cunnington said. "Are your tank engines seized up from the mud?" Patton asked. "Certainly not. They are in excellent mechanical condition," Cunnington said. "Then why in the hell are your tracks not moving?" Patton asked. "We are maintaining our positions according to the Field Marshal's explicit directive to secure the sector," Cunnington said, rising slowly to his feet. Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the stone room. "You stand here talking about a measured, textbook victory while the enemy walks away through an open back door," Patton said. "A victory where the enemy escapes is just a postponed defeat. Your textbook belongs in a museum, not on a battlefield where men are bleeding. You have spent the morning congratulating yourselves on a trap that has no bottom," Patton said. "You brag about a neat, risk-free perimeter while 20,000 panzer troops slip into the trees to regroup. Those are the same troops who will be killing American and British boys in 3 months because you value a clean uniform over a decisive fight Major Kelly came in here with ironclad photographic proof of a massive German retreat, Patton said. You called his intelligence garbage and laughed him out of the room because his reality disrupted your comfortable strategy. He has seen his people burn in the dirt while your armor sits idle by the roadside. You have a choice, Brigadier, Patton said. Order your idle tanks forward to close that geographical gap immediately, or I will wipe your boundary lines off this map, send my own Third Army across the sector to finish the job, and notify the global press that Montgomery let the German army walk away to save his own pride. If you won't fight them, Brigadier, get out of my way so I can. Cunnington stared at the general, his face draining of color, completely silenced. The British officers inside the room sat frozen, paralyzed by the sudden breach of diplomatic protocol and the cold finality in Patton's voice. Brigadier Cunnington looked at the map, then back at Patton's ivory revolvers. Realizing his comfortable game of political chess had just been permanently upended, without speaking another word, he reached for his secure field telephone and dialed the division command post. His voice trembled slightly as he issued the new coordinates, stripping away the artificial boundary lines that had protected the enemy for days. Outside, the silence of the Normandy morning was instantly shattered by the roar of hundreds of diesel engines kicking into life. Heavy tracks ground into the gravel roads as columns of British Cromwell and Sherman tanks surged forward, throwing up massive plumes of gray dust. The idle machines were finally moving, racing to plug the remaining 18-mile corridor before the window slammed shut. From his jeep, Major Kelly watched the steel columns roll past, the heavy scent of exhaust and churned earth filling the air. Through the open gap, the retreating German troops saw the horizon suddenly fill with the silhouette of advancing Allied armor. The escape route was closed. The trap was finally locked shut in a massive, public display of overwhelming force that no military bureaucrat could deny. Major Kelly returned home to Pittsburgh in the autumn of 1945 after the German surrender. He went back to the steel foundry, stepping back into his role as a foreman, though the fires of the blast furnaces constantly reminded him of the burning armor he had seen across Europe. He lived a quiet, unassuming life with his family, refusing to join veteran organizations or participate in local parades. He never told his son about the tense meeting in Normandy or the intervention of General Patton, preferring to leave the violence of the war behind him. Kelly died peacefully at his home in 1982. Brigadier Cunnington remained in the military bureaucracy after the conclusion of hostilities, retiring from the British Army in 1951 with his rank and social standing intact. He published a dense volume of personal memoirs in 1958, dedicating hundreds of pages to the brilliant tactical maneuvers of the Normandy campaign. In his writings, he completely omitted any mention of the idle tanks or the shouting match over the Falaise boundary lines. He lived out his days in his family estate in Wiltshire, bitter about the decline of the old empire. Until his death in 1969, General Patton never mentioned the incident in his personal diaries or his public correspondence. He kept Major Kelly's aerial photographs locked in the bottom drawer of his field desk until his fatal automobile accident in December 1945. He once told a close staff officer that a politician with a map is far more dangerous than an enemy with a gun. Some historians have argued that the cautious approach taken by the British High Command at the Falaise pocket was a necessary administrative safeguard to prevent tragic friendly fire incidents between rapidly converging Allied armies. They contend that maintaining strict boundary lines preserved organizational order and prevented chaotic battlefield collisions. Others have argued the opposite, asserting that excessive caution and political posturing allowed the core of Germany's veteran Western forces to escape and rebuild their strength. What is certain is that the closing of the gap, forced by raw determination on the ground, ultimately sealed the fate of the remaining German troops in Normandy and cemented a hard-fought victory. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have broken diplomatic protocol to secure a tactical victory, or would you have respected the established alliance boundaries? Let us know in the comments below, And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.